protections in racial justice. We especially want to thank Marco for recognizing that labor efforts are not an excuse to cut back on the vital work of advancing knowledge, teaching undergraduates with the skills they need for citizenship in their professional lives, and the many other vital tasks of faculty members and graduate students. Last summer, Marco asked graduate students involved in labor efforts to recommend speakers that really address this semester's theme, and we're especially thankful for his generosity and mentorship. So to provide a little bit of context, the historian Nancy McLean makes clear financial market-based values, when applied to political and social life, originate in the racist context of the economist James Buchanan and others' efforts to remove the authority of the federal government to enforce racially integrating public schools following Brown versus Board of Education. Last week, Julia Schleck, in her fantastic dialogue with Christopher Mufeld, spoke about her book, Dirty Knowledge, and the easy to misunderstand, fierce struggle academics engage to create new knowledge. As we listen to Dr. McCoy, we hope many of us will form connections from last week's dialogue and the labor conditions of higher education.
What our current moment has revealed to us is that democracy cannot exist without collective grassroots action like that of a labor union. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Austin McCoy, has made these crucial connections throughout his work as an assistant professor at West Virginia University and as a public intellectual. In one of his 2022 op-eds in Truthout, McCoy stated that, quote, "The curtailment of democracy runs deeper than the far-right attacks on the electoral process," and that, quote, "media conversations about the decline of, or the threat to, representative democracy obscures how participatory democracy in all areas of life has driven change, or at least opened possibilities for transformation." From protests against police violence in 2014 to 2015, and again in 2020, to the campaign to abolish student debt, to unions created at Amazon, Starbucks, and across the country at universities just like UNL, collective movements have resulted in the most transformative moments in history. Tonight, Dr. McCoy will share this work with us in his talk titled Organizing the Revolution, Workers' Visions of Economic Democracy in the US After the 1960s. The 1960s were a time of civic unrest in the service of intersectional justice. From the formation of the United Farm Workers to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to Title IX, these victories were possible because of the mass movements and mobilization that happened across the country. And yet, since then, labor unions have been on the decline, and efforts around the country to take away rights from the historically marginalized have increased in fervor. What happened? How can we understand our present moment in the light of the patterns of the past, and where can we go from here? These are some of the central questions of the presentation tonight. Dr. McCoy's research interests focus on African American history, the US left, labor and political economy, and social movements and activism. He is working on a book tentatively titled The Quest for Democracy, Black Power, New Left, and Progressive Politics in the Post-Industrial Midwest, which revises conventional explanations emphasizing the separation and decline of black power and the New Left in the US during the 1970s and 1980s. Ultimately, the project shows how progressives scored victories in local elections, as well as anti-war and anti-police violence campaigns, and their struggles against deindustrialization influenced national political discourse. All of these things have salient connections to our present moment and to the futures we can envision.
Unionized UNL recognizes this crucial moment that we're in. As one protest sign from a different university reads, "Our working conditions are your learning conditions." According to the MIT cost of living calculator and the most recent data we have available, there is between a $10,000 and $16,000 gap between the average UNL graduate student stipend and the estimated cost of living in Lancaster County for a single person without children. The stipends of UNL graduate students are also among the lowest in the Big Ten. Each semester, graduate students must pay, if I did my math right, about $1,964.24 for a full-time 9-credit-hour semester, in addition to over $1,500 a semester for health insurance. Unionize UNL started in 2017 and has since grown to a 10-person leadership committee and close to 400 graduate students who completed a commitment survey indicating they would like the protections of a union. This organization has focused on growing awareness about the ways to afford basic needs for food, internet, and bodily autonomy. Unionized UNL members also meet with graduate students in different departments, faculty members, and local grassroots groups. As we listen to Dr. McCoy tonight, if you're a graduate student, consider completing the commitment survey you can find through some QR codes in our zines out on the table, and talking to somebody out at the table for some more information. There's also great stickers and zines, and if you're a faculty member, consider further researching the labor conditions of your graduate students, which we know many of you are already doing. If you're a community member, consider the benefits of labor movements, especially for communities of color, that help families meet basic needs in your industry and here in Nebraska. I want to thank all of you for attending tonight's presentation. Please join us in welcoming the wonderful Dr. Austin McCoy.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. I wanted to thank Marco and Carolina and Zoe for the great introductions. Very inspiring. And I just hope that I can sort of live up to some of this, some of what has been said. I also want to thank the folks who sort of helped, the other folks who helped put this together, whether it is other organizers or the folks who work in the museum, because obviously, without staff folks, like the university really doesn't move at all, it doesn't go. But this is about to move, so I need to know. So, the title of my talk tonight is called Organizing the Revolution, Workers' Visions of Economic Democracy in the United States After the 1960s. So it's interesting that Marco said that next year y'all will be talking about anarchism and abolitionism. So I'm here to let you know I'm going to sort of preempt some of that. So I may not be the 50th person, but this will sort of start next year off. So I was asked to talk about democracy, and we hear this term that's thrown around, and especially in the last, obviously since 2016, but then also obviously since January 6th, and rightfully there's been a lot of hand-wringing about the crisis of democracy in the United States, but obviously the crisis of representative democracy, which is like what we should just be using. We should be using that term. Just like if someone's talking about budget cuts or anything like that, you use the term austerity, right? It's like we should be more precise. So, what we have is a representative democracy, right? And we sort of operate in a federalist system, right? And the point of the system is to make power diffuse, at least among regular folks, right? So obviously, if you own private property, you own capital, then you're going to have better control over the state than regular folks, right? And in order to sort of take control over resources, right, it requires people who don't own capital, who don't sort of have proximity to political power to band together and sort of use that people power as a counterweight. So even that aspect is sort of more democratic than the representative democracy that we claim to have is. But obviously, right, sort of there have been contemporary assaults on representative democracy, and I wanted to sort of start here, right? Because if you think about, organizers and leaders like Grayson Boggs, James Boggs, who were two radical organizers out of Detroit, and they would often sort of lead their talks with, what time is it on the clock of the world? And this is the clock right here, right? This list, stretching back into the early 2010s, right? So this is way before January 6th. Whether you're talking about the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, but then also moving into sort of our more contemporary moment in terms of, racist policing and state violence, right? That also sort of hampers people's political participation. Obviously, the direct attacks on black folks, queer, trans folks, right, poor people. So when we think about sort of what moment we're in, we are in sort of amid a counter movement, right? A counter movement that has sort of been operating throughout the country historically, right? I mean, when you're thinking about anti-black racism, but sort of in the last 10 years, right? This is just a short list, right? I mean, I'm sure we can sort of think of more, but this is sort of where we're at, right? I mean, and it seems as if there are just more people who are sort of, might call themselves a little more liberal, call themselves, sort of centrist Democrats, or even some who might be centrist Republicans, are sort of finally sort of opening their eyes to, wait, this just isn't happening to marginalized people. This is happening to us, right? And what is happening is you have a Republican Party that is sort of hell-bent on minority rule, that is sort of trying to sort of, implement, in some ways, right, on the one hand, sort of a racialized, system of apartheid that, South Africa, once had legally, but then even sort of bringing back some of the Jim Crow sort of policies in terms of, just voter restrictions, which is, again, sort of predated January 6th, right? I mean, so authoritarianism is violent, but violence works in sort of multiple ways. It's not just a bunch of, extremist folks, running up on the Capitol, right? I mean, it's sort of encoded in policy. So representative democracy has sort of always been manipulated. It has always been in crisis, and we know that that's just not enough, right? I mean, and there have been other sort of visions of democracy that come out of the labor movement that is sort of seeking to incorporate at least economic relations. So between 1935 and 1945, the Congress of Industrial Organizations promoted a robust notion of industrial democracy. And trade unionists such as CIO President John Lewis advocated for restoring the balance between workers and employers in bargaining during this period. And Lewis, called for democratic or more democratic decision-making in industry. And I'm going to quote, you see the quote on your screen. If we are to have political democracy in this land of ours, we must also have industrial democracy. Democracy in our industrial establishments, which will recognize the rights of those who work for a living, are equal to those who merely profit from the labor of those for a living. And Lewis stated this in a article, that is, that appeared in March 1937. Right? I mean, so sort of coming out of the sit-down strikes in the Midwest, especially in the auto industry, you had workers, you had leaders that were trying to sort of launch a different vision of how to relate politically and economically in the United States. And, we can even go back to the International Workers of the World, right, and sort of other, socialists, communists in the early 20th century. But sort of, I'm sort of starting with what we consider sort of a more modern period in industrial relations. So industrial democracy, right, this idea, more decision-making power among workers within the economy. You cannot have political democracy without industrial democracy. And how this was manifested, it would be manifested legally and sort of a little more narrowly through collective bargaining, the process in which workers band together as a union and they begin to sort of bargain on behalf of the whole workforce within a particular plant or within the whole industry. And this contract, right, it sort of bound the labor union with the employer. And this, sort of the biggest one, significantly sort of takes place in the late 1940s and sort of culminates in the 1950 contract between the United Auto Workers and General Motors. And, obviously this is following the Weimar Act. So this is following sort of the establishment of the National Labor Relations Board, sort of that sets down the sort of structure. for collective bargaining and relations between organized labor and, and employers. So the Treaty of Detroit is sort of what observers came to call this 5-year contract between GM and UAW. And this contract ensured that labor, ensured, quote, labor peace by extending wage and benefit increases. It also sort of established an employer-paid pension, as well as employer-paid health insurance. So there are some compromises that the UAW makes, right? Because before this, the UAWs and Walter Reuther were sort of struggling for government-funded insurance, right? I mean, so like this idea of a single-payer system, a state-paid system, there's a tradition of this politics that is stretching back at least to the 1930s and 1940s with the UAW and the CIO. So this contract, sort of ensures some of the aspects of collective bargaining that we take for granted, or many workers took for granted until the late 1970s through the 1980s and 1990s. But again, there were some things that the UAW decided to give up or had to give up. So on the one hand, in this 5 years, there would be no strikes. Right? I mean, so there's a no strike clause, which I'm sort of setting the table for what's going to come in the late 1960s and through the 1970s. So no strikes for 5 years because this is a legally binding contract. If the union decides to strike, they're breaking the contract, which then means that the employers could sort of take legal action. The second piece, which is also sort of setting the table for what happens, following this, is it really doesn't challenge the private property rights of General Motors, nor other corporations, right? Because again, this contract sets the table for future negotiations in the auto industry, and it's sort of and I hate to sort of use this term, it sort of kind of trickles down or trickles across industry, where you begin to see more unions sort of trying to strike, or not necessarily strike, but trying to get deals that are like 3 to 5 years, right? Which then sort of again locks unions into this relationship. So doesn't challenge private property rights, which means that corporations still can sort of choose where to invest capital. They can choose to still close down plants and move them elsewhere. So this becomes a problem, right? In the 1970s, this is sort of where it really begins to blow up. But then also, right, corporations could invest in wherever they see fit when it comes to technology, and sort of use technology again to sort of displace workers. So these are some of the compromises that the UAW makes in this contract. But this is sort of heralded, right? This is a celebrated achievement for the UAW and other workers, and it's sort of celebrated among political, folks who are sort of observing politically, right? I mean, because again, quote unquote, you would have labor peace. So what I want to do, through the rest of the talk is sort of talk about the ways in which, right, one, representative democracy is just not enough to secure full citizenship, right? I mean, let alone freedom, which is what many black workers are sort of striving for. And economic democracy is necessary for full citizenship. And this is sort of what you'll see when I talk about the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the Black Workers Congress. But then, when thinking about where we're at today in academia, economic democracy during this period. So one of the major sort of uprisings among black workers, it took place in Detroit on May 2nd, so sort of several weeks or a few weeks after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who also was assassinated in Memphis while trying to support sanitation workers, right? So on May 2nd, 1968, more than 4,000 workers participated in a wildcat strike that paralyzed the Dodge main plant in Hamtramck, Michigan, which is sort of a suburb of Detroit. Dodge, ultimately disproportionately held black workers responsible, and they also, so what they did was they ended up firing and suspending dozens of black workers. And immediately after the strike, General Baker Jr., along with Mike Hamlin, John Watson, Kenneth Cockrell, and others, formed the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, or DRUM, to defend the fired black workers, right? Because this initial wildcat strike was interracial, but seeing who was being punished disproportionately, this led black workers who had already been doing organizing work within the city and among workers to sort of formally establish a black revolutionary union organization. So, like many other rank-and-file uprisings of the period, Drum founders saw the leading trade unions like the United Auto Workers or the UAW or the AFL-CIO as too bureaucratic and obstructive when it came to workers seeking to acquire more control over their conditions of work. And Drum would aim to organize black workers to challenge discrimination and deplorable work conditions in Dodge plants, as well as racism within the UAW. So, you know, sort of what were some of the conditions that Drum specifically were rebelling against? So, the speed up, I mean, so this idea that you had employers that were trying to force workers to, you know, produce more, you know, and sort of conduct their tasks more quickly. So you had speed up that they were rebelling against, mandatory overtime, where, you know, and then you also had other conditions that, you know, where 60% of its workforce in Chrysler was black. I mean, so like they sort of took a anti-racist, you know, view of the ways in which they were being treated in the Dodge plants. So blacks were often sort of, you know, obviously hired last, first to be fired. They often were sort of working in the sort of dirtiest tasks, you know, within the auto plants, but this also sort of stretched into steel and coal as well. And then Drum members, you know, also sort of began to sort of think about the ways in which automation sort of intersected with speed up. So they came up with the term and they called it niggermation, and this refers to Drum members who argued that you know, Chrysler, Dodge, and these other plants were you know, forcing black workers to increase their productivity, and they did so, they claimed, by, you know, trying to get black workers, 1 or 2 black workers, that would, you know, do the work of 4 or 5 white workers, right? I mean, so like, this is, you know, John Watson, who was one of the sort of intellectuals of Drum, you know, this was the argument that he was making, and this sort of, you know, becomes one, a sort of watch, you know, sort of something, a watchword for many of the black activists and many of the black workers, and you know, this is, again, sort of black workers, you know, taking an anti-racist analysis of sort of automation, but then also sort of the ways in which, you know, their employers were forcing them to sort of produce more, which, you know, again, right, I mean, the idea of the speed up is nothing new, and, you know, I'm sure many of you probably have experienced this in some way, some shape, form, or fashion, right, this being sort of speeding up, or, you know, if you're not allowed to hire, you know, extra instructors, right, you're often stuck doing the work of multiple people. So, you know, again, these ideas, rather old in labor history. But then there were also critiques of, again, the UAW. So like other black labor caucuses, you know, within other labor unions, the group's founders criticized the UAW, you know, often for sort of the lack of diversity, you know, within the UAW ranks. So Drum releases 14 demands in response to the discipline of black workers, and these 14 demands were grounded in the principle of self-determination. And these demands were released to Chrysler and the UAW. So in addition to calling for the reinstatement of fired workers with back pay, their demands centered on diversifying plant operations. So this meant hiring more black foremen, more black superintendents, more black managers, more black doctors and nurses, right? I mean, so again, you're sort of examining the ways in which, you know, work tasks, right, and sort of, you know, the positions were racialized. But they also called for the redistribution of a portion of union dues paid to UAW to be paid to black communities to, quote, aid in self-determination for black people, right? I mean, so they're also calling on the union to sort of help support black communities or demand that they pay back black communities. So, This again would sort of, this again is sort of an example of this idea of black people, believing, since they sort of predominate, whether they predominate in cities or within a particular workforce, that they were entitled, right, to the resources that they help produce. This is sort of one sort of aspect of black power. But then they also called for giving more power to black workers to investigate grievances and paying South African Chrysler workers equal to US-based workers, and this sort of will come back, installing a, quote, brother as head of the board of directors, right? So in terms of what's going on in South Africa, right, you have black folks, workers especially, sort of organizing and fighting, literally fighting against apartheid, but then also you would see examples of sort of international solidarity among, black workers in the United States, whether it is the folks in drum or dock workers on the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest, and South African workers. But then also this latter point, right, installing the, quote, brother as head board of directors, right, again, sort of signifies this idea that black people should have more control over, over these factories, right? So this demand comes back. So Drum joined the Black Panther Party as a black radical organization that sought to organize a revolutionary vanguard group based on race and class. And like the Black Panther Party, Drum incorporated black nationalism and Marxist-Leninism and articulated an interlocking critique of racism, imperialism, and capitalism. Yet the Black Panther Party, their leaders, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, sought to organize what they, the lumpen proletariat, this sort of group of, folks in Marxist theory, the group of folks that are sort of, in the sort of like dregs of society, right? So like, for Marx, it's like, the criminal element is sort of like the central, element of the lumpen proletariat, and he argues that, this element is counter-revolutionary, whereas the Black Panther Party are arguing, we're trying to organize, quote, brothers on the block, and we see, the folks who are sort of, been evacuated from the industrial economy or locked out of the industrial economy as the most revolutionary force. Drum, takes a more sort of, orthodox stance, and they try to argue that, no, it's the working class, but in particular with the United States, it's the black working class that is the most revolutionary force in the country, and that could be the force that would sort of propel the working class as a whole to revolution. So drum activists argued that blacks were, quote, strategically located at the point of production in the national economy, which would, again, offer them a source of power and leverage. And if black workers organized themselves, Drum contended, then they could bring all production to a halt, thus striking a blow against racism and capitalism. So Drum would try to, they embarked a little bit in sort of union politics. So union dissidents aimed to take control over union locals in the various plants within the city. Yet their efforts to exert influence in these locals mostly resulted in failure, right? Because again, you had the UAW, who was, opposing, right? They were running their own candidates, their own slate, so they were opposing Drum. But then also you had, not every single black worker sort of agreed with Drum's approach, and then obviously you would have some white workers who, who were radical, but not all of them were sort of going to join with Drum to sort of support them as well. So Ron March, who was a member of Drum, entered the preliminary election for trustee of Local 3 in September 1968 against Joe Elliott, a white man who enjoyed the support of the local's leadership. March won the preliminary election despite suspicion of voter irregularities and harassment of March supporters. Yet March would go on to lose the October runoff, and viewing March and Drum as a possible threat, the UAW and Local 3 leadership sprang into action, over the course of the election. So they warned a March win would result in a cut in retirement benefits. That was sort of one example of the sort of scare tactics that UAW and Local 3 leadership used. And Drum members would ultimately protest to no avail that it was union interference and police harassment that contributed to March's loss and many of their losses in general. So You know, again, like with Drum and UAW, you know, like they, you know, Drum tried a mountain challenge, but were not successful in sort of getting their candidates into, you know, union leadership. But folks like Mike Hamlin, who was, again, one of the founders of Drum, would argue that it would be Drum's sort of efforts to challenge the UAW that forced the UAW to diversify its ranks, even if it was on the UAW's terms. So, over time, right, I mean, in the next couple of years, sort of like the Black Panther Party, Drum sort of expands pretty quickly. And as it expands, like you begin to see some tensions among the group leadership emerge. And this is something that is not particular to sort of Drum, right? I mean, like this is something that happens with many sort of, you know, organizing groups. So a question, you know, would emerge among, you know, the leadership. And the question would be, should the emerging movement concentrate on organizing on the shop floor, or should it seek to organize Black workers and communities generally? So like there were debates, you know, so on the one hand you had Kenneth Cockrell, Mike Hamlin, and John Watson who were arguing that Drum should continue to sort of expand, and more revolutionary union movements expanded throughout metropolitan Detroit. And what ends up happening before the split is that they create an umbrella group called the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And so, you know, between 1969 and 1971, kind of into 72, the League is sort of in operation, and this is sort of where these debates are taking place. So you had, on the other hand, though, you had folks like General Baker, Marion Kramer, who would argue that, no, like, the League and Drums should organize at the point of production or organize on the shop floor. So what ends up happening is you just have a split between these two groups. And the split is more complicated than that, right? There are debates around, you know, Black national, like should, you know, the group take a more Black nationalist stance as opposed to a Marxist-Leninist stance. There are also sort of personal issues that are coming up, which again happens, you know, when folks organize, and you know, you're spending a lot of time together. So the League splits in 1971, and what ends up happening is Mike Hamlin invites James Foreman, who was, you know, formerly a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He also had affiliated himself with the Black Panther Party for a moment, and he invites him to Detroit to sort of, you know, sort of observe what's happening with you know, the Black labor organizing in the city. And what ends up happening is Mike Hamlin, Ken Cockrell, and John Watson, they join with Foreman to create the Black Workers Congress that summer. So rather than just trying to organize Black workers in factories, the Black Workers Congress envisioned itself as a broad umbrella group that would form coalitions of workers of color, right? I mean, so not just focusing on Black workers, but focusing on all workers of color. So the group would appeal to, you know, groups that were sort of part of the, quote, third world groups such as Asian, Arab, Indigenous, Hispanic, and Latinx peoples. And to build its organization quickly, Foreman, you know, would serve as sort of the titular national leader, and he utilized his connections, his, you know, prior connections, while leading SNCC to organize activists and like-minded workers across the country. So the Black Workers Congress is one of these groups that is, you know, rather understudied. I think more folks will begin to sort of look at this organization, but it was also rather short-lived, right? I mean, so sometimes what happens when you're organizing is you're successful with getting people together. They were actually able to, you know, hold a conference in September 1971, where you know, 400 workers of color gathered in Gary, Indiana, right? I mean, so a major steel town, still at that point. And they tried to sort of hammer out, like, what kind of, how will this organization operate? Because Foreman wanted it to also be an international organization. So Foreman is not only taking trips throughout the United States, he's taking trips in China, African countries, sort of trying to build solidarity that way, which, you know, again, you have Black Panther leaders doing the same thing. So what ends up happening, though, is sometimes when you sort of try to build an organization, what you do is produce a lot of sort of visionary elements, but you may not necessarily get the organization off the ground, and that's sort of what happens with the Black Workers Congress. But what they do is they sort of produce their own sorts of plans and sort of position papers around the steel industry, but then they also release a sort of a very comprehensive manifesto. And this is a 32-point manifesto, right? So if you think about the Black Panther Party, 10-point plan, right? That is pretty brief, 32 points. That's a pamphlet, right? And that's something that you're going to have reading groups around and stuff, which there's nothing wrong with. But you can sort of see how these pieces could be used as organizing tools, and it's like you're going to have to sort of spend more time with people discussing the manifesto. But the good thing about the manifesto is in its comprehensiveness, and it becomes a sort of model, for how to sort of envision an abolitionist politics. So in 1971, they released this, and they're outlining, they outline their demands, and it is an example of abolitionist democracy, right? This idea of abolishing oppressive systems and building sort of more democratic institutions in its place, right? This sort of has its roots with W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, where he sort of positions abolitionist democracy as a sort of lost opportunity during the Reconstruction moment. So this document is very inclusive. It calls for the elimination of racism, sexism, and imperialism, and various forms of state violence, while advocating for aspects of economic justice and democracy. And the BWC presented they present, carceral and welfare or warfare state abolitionist demands and objectives 19 and 23. The organization, called for the abolition of, and I quote, the brutal penal system of the United States, the elimination and smashing of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, the counterinsurgency forces. And they also call for a, quote, a destruction of all the armed, vicious, brutal, militaristic police forces in the United States that kill people at random, terrorize the population. These are some of the sort of abolitionist sort of principles or demands that they call for. But then as you see on your right, one of the first demands is regarding industrial or economic democracy. Right? So they call for, quote, the workers' control of the places of work, factories, mines, fields, offices, transportation service, communication facilities, so that the exploitation of labor will cease and no person or corporation will get rich off the labor of another person, but all people will work for the collective benefit of humanity, and that is number one. Right? You had, again, abolitionist principles throughout, but number one, workers' control. BWC sort of states its manifesto, sort of grounds it in a sort of long-standing call among radical labor unions and labor organizers. And then I have number 6 sort of, highlighted, and that's sort of the call, again, for the abolition of police forces. That's the only, I thought I had another screen, but maybe I don't have it there. But they would also call for free childcare, free education. So again, this is sort of a very sort of comprehensive, manifesto that is both abolitionist, but then also grounded in workers' control, industrial democracy, also grounded in social democracy as well, when thinking about the ways in which they wanted public goods to be mobilized and used to help regular people. So by 1975, I'm not going to go through that yet. By 1975, Mike Hamlin was a remaining working class leader that engaged in BWC work. And Hamlin acknowledged later, quote, I left organizational work in the middle of the 1970s as a matter of personal survival. By then, the BWC would sort of be a shell of itself, with much of its principal leadership departed. So Cockrell, sort of goes into doing anti-police brutality work. There was a unit called Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets. It was a clandestine unit, undercover unit that was responsible for killing 21 Black Detroiters between January 1971 and February 1974. Right? So Cockrell other black workers, right, who were sort of affiliated with Drum, the League, BWC, they sort of move and they shift into doing that work. Whereas John Watson basically just pulls out of the movement. He's burned out, pulls out of the movement, and goes back to school. And Mike Hamlin continued to do some organizing work, but just in a different capacity. So, this idea of Drum, BWC, League sort of withering over time, right, is sort of what's happening with the labor movement, sort of larger. Like, you would still have wildcats that were taking place in places like Detroit, especially in 1973, 1974, the Lordstown strike in 1972, but then, over time, these wildcat strikes would sort of decline. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time sort of talking about some of the dilemmas surrounding the outcomes of labor radical organizing in the 1970s. So in many histories of the New Left and the labor movement, this period is marked by failure and decline in radical organizations and labor unions. And while this is not untrue, my work focuses on sort of thinking about other aspects of this moment, right? So like the different types of beginnings of different organizations, the continuations or the continuities and ideas that are being expressed, and contribution and sort of political and intellectual contributions to the left tradition in the United States. So, of course, measuring success and failure is important, especially if you're a social scientist. I'm more interested in the sort of subtleties and the resonance or resonance of ideas in politics, as well as the subtleties in success and defeat. So, my work, I sort of envision it as following in sort of the footsteps of scholars like Howard Brick, Christopher Phelps, Mary Frances Berry, Keanu Yamada Taylor, Robin Kelly, and others. I'm curious about how radical and progressive ideas might change over time or sort of move from, quote, margin to center, whether it is in left or mainstream politics. So with this, right, here's one example of this, right? So remember when I talked about Drum calling for installing a, quote, brother on the as a sort of the leader of the board of directors of Chrysler. What ends up happening is over the next 10 years, Chrysler, is one of the 3 major auto manufacturers in the United States that struggles, right? It struggles financially for various reasons, which sort of culminates in the 1979-1980 Chrysler Corporation crisis. And as the corporation teetered on the brink of failure, UAW President Doug Frazier, Detroit Mayor Coleman Young, right, Detroit's first black mayor, and other Michigan officials trekked to Washington, D.C. to appeal for federal help. And I'm not going to go into too many details, but the negotiations produced conflicting results, like the Treaty of Detroit. On the one hand, Frazier and the UAW called for the union to have a seat on Chrysler's board of directors, which, again, sort of echoes Drum's call for a brother to have a seat. On the other hand, though, this is taking place in a moment of concessionary bargaining, where you have corporations that are sort of extracting concessions from workers. So Chrysler workers, had to give up wage concessions, right? And this sort of amounted to a 13% pay cut for the corporation to receive $400 million in loan guarantees, right? So workers had to give up money just for Chrysler to be able to take out a loan from the federal government, right? How imbalanced does that sound, right? So on the appearance, right, it seemed like the union might have won some greater recognition with Frazier taking a seat on the board, but really Frazier, would end up being isolated on the board, and the deal came at a great cost. But ironically, you have black radical groups like Drum and progressive organizations like Kenneth Cockrell's Detroit Alliance for a Rational Economy, who also called for seats on Chrysler's board, right? So it wasn't just UAW that was making these demands, it was other sort of radicals in Detroit. And Ken Cockrell, right, coming out of Drum, coming out of the League, coming out of the BWC, is sort of, at least his organization, because at this point, he's a city council person, right? He runs as an independent socialist in 1977 and wins. They're also making this demand. So again, this is sort of one example of the ways in which you have these ideas or these demands that sort of persist over time. And sometimes, some folks get what they want, but it isn't what they want ultimately, right? In terms of the cost of this sort of package that was put together. So I'm also curious about the conundrums that accompany labor and radical organizing. So while employers defeated rank-and-file rebellion, right, along with the help of some union leaders, the emerging movement underscored labor's dilemma. It was caught within a declining structure of post-war collective bargaining. So workers understood that they needed strong, so in this case, right, workers understood they needed strong unions. Yet they also needed more solidarity and power within organized labor to remake the unions, which, again, a lot of these sort of insurgencies within the UAW, the United Mine Workers, they often were defeated by those who were already in power within these labor unions. So for any of the radical demands for or visions of economic democracy to be implemented, workers needed more democracy within their unions to build the power to struggle to enact economic transformation around democratic values. And again, so this is a dilemma, right? I mean, you need more solidarity to build more power within in order to challenge those who are already in power within the labor union. And if you're fortunate enough to win, then you sort of still need to sort of expand your power across the union nationally, right? And this is, again, something that the like folks within the UAW, whether you're talking about the UAW or the AFL-CIO, where you talk about insurgencies like the New Directions campaign during the 1980s, where like you had this very thing. And some would argue that John Sweeney's ascendancy to the presidency of the AFL-CIO in 1995 represented such a win for insurgencies within labor struggles. But again, by then you're sort of at the sort of height of the sort of decline of organized labor. So timing and context matter. Workers needed power at a time when capital was on the offensive. Businesses went on the offensive against unions more generally during the 1970s, threatening to move factories in response to unionization and potential strikes, strategically utilizing production techniques such as sort of automation and using sped-up work. They also forced unions, again, to concede on the post-war labor-employer social contract of higher wages and benefits, and opposing policies that would force employers to relinquish control over capital investment. So in effect, employers found a way to circumvent the Treaty of Detroit legally, leaving labor unions defending a collective bargaining structure that could not contain capital. So like this structure could not prevent capitalists from moving their capital away from workers and away from communities. So these policies, along with the privatization of public goods and services, helped redistribute wealth upward and impoverish workers further. And again, all this is bolstered by the private sector's wins in the legislative arena. They helped defeat labor law reform. They defamed full employment legislation. Presidents from both parties deregulated industries, supported anti-work economic policies in their efforts to reduce inflation, facilitated the creation of a, quote, new economy, privileging high tech and finance. And then, as we know, President Reagan in 1981 broke the air traffic controller strike, or the Panther strike. So again, right, this is the context of the counter-revolution against workers, right? So timing, again, matters. But just because labor had been on the defensive since the 1970s doesn't mean that workers cannot change their fortunes, right? I mean, so not all political orders last forever, as we've seen with challenges to neoliberalism since the Great Recession in 2007 through 2009. Whether we're talking about the Occupy movement or the movement for Black Lives, or even coming from the right with the Tea Party. So we might be living in a new labor upsurge as workers in both the private sector, right, so Amazon workers, Starbucks workers, and the public sector, right, academics, especially graduate students, including those here, are sort of back on the march. And motivated by ballooning debt, precarity at work, and the coronavirus pandemic, many workers are learning that they might not have a choice but to organize and strike as employers seek to squeeze every ounce of work and time from their workforce, while demanding that they perform their job duties without earning living wages and benefits. Right? I mean, so many folks in academia especially are being asked to do a lot more with a lot less and for a lot less, right? So again, sort of, getting us to think about sort of, I'm probably preaching to the choir for the most part here, but, sort of getting us to think about where we're at. So we've seen this in the last few weeks as faculty at Rutgers struck for higher wages and better benefits, but also for, among, precarious faculty or faculty working in sort of precarious positions, but then also among grad students. So you had a moment of solidarity where you had tenured faculty, also bargaining for guaranteed graduate funding and job security for adjuncts. And then as we know, members of University of Michigan's Graduate Employee Organization have been on strike for weeks for increased wages, but also better trans health care and the creation of a non-police response unit, right? I mean, so GEO since 2020 have been sort of incorporating abolitionist principles and ideas into their demands. And that is sort of represents an evolution in GEO's collective bargaining structure, aided by social movements that are taking place within the city, some of which I was a part of. So that's a sort of another thing to think about, right? The ways in which labor unions can sort of, and I don't mean this in a derogatory manner, but sort of you're drafting off the momentum of other sort of campaigns, right? I mean, because that's sort of how some of this can work. I can explain how some of this works if you ask me in the Q&A, but I mean, that's something that we noticed at Michigan, and something that we all sort of encourage. So while we have politicians across the country that seek to delegitimize higher education and their attacks on Black and gender studies, attacks on tenure and job security, it is no surprise, again, that more workers are organizing and striking. And this is sort of underscoring the argument that, right, economic democracy must extend to every workplace, especially where we teach, learn, and work. But as more of us start going to more union meetings and walking picket lines, we have to keep in mind that the past efforts to envision what economic democracy means. So it just goes beyond the very important bread and butter issues of better wages, better benefits, but it also extends to questions about what does it mean to truly work in a democratic workplace, or what would it mean for workers in academia, staff, faculty, graduate students, athletes, to have greater control over their workplace. How do we do so in a manner that allows everyone to flourish without demanding that they must identify with the brand of their employer? So while we keep these questions in mind, we have to continue to sort of try to break out of this conundrum of sort of needing more solidarity, to get more power, to then challenge, and then using that challenge to then build more power, right? I mean, like, we have to sort of figure out, right, like, how do we sort of crack this code? And many workers historically, right, have done this by breaking rules, right? I mean, so you can argue that organized labor during the 1970s was sort of contained by the legal system, and you had labor leaders who were, from their perspective, it was reasonable to not try to break these rules, right? We don't want employers sort of trying to sue us out of existence, right? But how did these movements sort of take place in the first place, right? I mean, like, you had people breaking the rules at work. They're sitting down. You had folks in Great Britain in the 19th century who were breaking tools, right? I mean, like, this is what happened, right? And why did this happen? It happened because employers did not want to extend any rights, right? So there comes a point where, again, people can only take so much. This is, again, we're in a moment where we have to rethink, sort of what will collective bargaining do and mean, right? And I think this is what GEO has done in a great way since 2020. It isn't just about bargaining for those of us who work within this space. It's also sort of bargaining for the whole community and sort of making sure that whatever employer that we work for isn't going to be complicit, in state violence, isn't going to be complicit in sort of, authoritarian policies, that affects everyone. Isn't going to be complicit in raising the cost of living by basically, colonizing every, aspect of a particular city or town that they exist in. So you have to, we're coming to a point where we're seeing this, right, where folks are realizing we might have to break some rules in order to get something done. But the only way to do this, right, is to have solidarity. Because there are times where there might just be one or two or three people who want to do something like this, but it only works if everyone sort of joins in, because they're not going to kick everyone out. They're not going to fire everyone, or they can try, right? But what happens is if you build enough solidarity, then you try to make sure that the second wave of folks that they might try to bring in are also going to continue to do the same thing, or they're going to say no, right? So you need solidarity. And workers and unions have to find ways to build solidarity across difference, culture, geography, and sectors. And they have to build enough solidarity for everyone to take these risks. And in doing so, obviously we know that it's about building power. And I think sort of leaving the last point to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on this point, makes a lot of sense, because every year, one of my pet peeves, you get a lot of people who want to quote, "I have a dream," right? That's the thing that we want to quote. We don't want to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and sort of his anti-racism in 1967, where he's challenging white liberals, or even from the letter of Birmingham jail. But we don't also talk about the ways in which he sought to disrupt the United States or Memphis, in 1968, around issues related to economic justice and labor rights, right? I mean, so Dr. King's, sort of explanation of what power was to Memphis workers, or workers in Memphis, I think, right, crystallized a lot of this, and some of this isn't new, right? We can all get more together than we can apart. We can get more organized together than we can apart. And this is the way we gain power. Power is the ability to achieve purpose. Power is the ability to affect change, and we need power, right? I mean, saying this at the height of the Black Power movement, right? What is power? Walter Reuther said once that, and he quoted, "Power is the ability of a labor union like the UAW to make the most powerful corporation in the world, General Motors, say yes when it wants to say no." That is power, right? And that is what you all are fighting for. Thank you.
We have time for questions. Just raise your hand, and then maybe I jump in and just take you up on your offer to elaborate. Oh, I'm sorry.
You want to go ahead, Marco?
Yeah, I just wanted to you to ask to elaborate on what you already promised to talk about the drafting from one movement to another.
So, this is like 2013, 2014, right? So this is the summer after George Zimmerman was acquitted. You had black students, undergrads, who came to campus, and they just started organizing and protesting around issues related to campus diversity. And we didn't know that this was going to happen. And what ends up happening is, they're protesting on the Diag, which is the main space, and they eventually launched a social media campaign that just blows up, right? So it's like they launched a hashtag, because this is sort of the beginnings of Twitter in some ways, and this blows up. And what ends up happening is they started a movement, around issues related to, what the administration would call diversity, equity, and inclusion. But while this is happening, you had students in other, from other groups who were organizing, right? So you had students organizing around, issues related to Palestine. You had, obviously, GEOs always sort of doing organizing work behind the scenes. You have more radicals, faculty, and students who were sort of organizing around issues related to neoliberalism in the university. And there came a point in January where you had protests, whether it was, we organized overnight teach-in, that, got hundreds of people. Black Student Union they were taking over public space, or like spaces within buildings. You had, the group of students who were organizing around Palestine doing a sit-in, and this sort of happened one after another. Like every week, there was like a major protest. And what was going on was solidarity, right? I mean, so you had folks who were sort of working with the Black Student Union, going and sort of sitting in with the students who were, organizing around Palestine or giving, resources. You had grad students, right, who were sort of supporting the Black Student Union. You had, folks who were sort of organizing and going to protests that were sort of planned by the more radical elements compared to these groups around issues related to sexual violence, right? I mean, so like every protest sort of had a critical mass of people because of all these other protests, because it just became an expectation. Oh, you're on campus today, you see a protest, you're going. So there came a point to where, all of this is happening, and it sort of established a protest culture. Or sort of reestablishment, I would say, at the University of Michigan, where if something happened, if the administration messed up, because that's something I was talking to the grad students about today, usually these things are generated by leaders, folks in power messing up, right? Sort of either overstepping or just, being negligent, all of the above. So obviously that's not something that you can just create, right? I mean, like, it's sort of, again, timing matter, right? I mean, like, I don't think this is as strong if the Zimmerman acquittal happens, right? I mean, even though we would have preferred it, some of us would have preferred him to be, found guilty. But that's what sort of motivated all of this. And then, we had sort of smaller elements of people who were organizing, but then they're sort of joining with these other elements, and it just sort of created a critical mass. So that's what I meant by drafting.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I had a request and a question.
Yeah.
And the request is just, a very standard scholarly one. I knew some of this history from listening to talks by people like Cedric Johnson or Tori Reed or others who are, very much out in the media. But I'd love to hear, your must-read kind of list of suggestions. I don't know if you'd be willing to share it with Marco or Zoe and Carolina, or some way to distribute that, but would love to get a reading list to learn more about this history. The question that I had was, you began by noting that there has been frequently in the last, in the public discourse, certainly in the last 5 years, like this supposed contention between those organizing on the left and those organizing in anti-racist kind of movements, and you push back against the idea that that's helpful or right. And so what would you, first of all, say to someone who would bring that up and would push for that division? How do we reply to that? And for those of us who are still, who are already kind of very much committed to this kind of history and this kind of politics going into the future, what would you recommend to us, and maybe specifically to those of us that are starting unions, right? So that much of this history is pushing back against established union leadership that's too conservative, that's racist, that's deeply embedded in a kind of established bureaucracy. For those of us that are just starting, what are some of the things we can build into those structures to try to make for a more equal union power within the union, as well as a more equal world that the union can push from outside? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, those are good questions. And so, yeah, reading list, I can do that. Might need a reminder, but I can do that. In terms of the race class question, right? I mean, this is such in some ways, I mean, I just even get annoyed thinking about it. Because, that's been, my adult life. Being a political person is, frankly, arguing with older white guys about this, because usually, well, it's race, it's class, what are you talking about race? And it's well, if we look at the history of the United States, right? So I'm not necessarily talking about histories of, Western Europe. No, issues related to, racism and capitalism have worked together, right? And I think that's been one of the benefits of all this literature about, racial capitalism that's come out. That was sort of, again, it was pioneered by scholars in South Africa, but Cedric Robinson, a political theorist, a black political theorist, sort of, he popularized it in the United States, and it's sort of taking a long time for it to become more popularized, right? I mean, so this idea that racism, capitalism, but then also sexism, obviously, are sort of mutually constitutive. And, this is, again, intersectionality. So usually, it's been a while, it's been a while since I've been in this conversation. Usually how I sort of intervene is I ask people to sort of think historically about the ways in which the economic system in the United States has developed. And no, black people were enslaved, obviously, and they were workers at the same time. That was W.B. Du Bois's intervention into Civil War Reconstruction historiography. And they weren't the only workers, right? I mean, I think what ends up happening in some of these debates is you begin to sort of, when you begin to try to argue sort of what's more foundational, I think part of the problem, I think politically, is then that sort of leads to an argument about well, who should be leading and who should be the vanguard. So, you know, on the one hand, I think we need to think about the development of capitalism in the United States in a more complex way that in some ways is, you know, connected to the history of the United States, but then also connected to global capitalism. But then also we need to sort of think more broadly about how we organize against it, right? I mean, and I think that's the point, right? I mean, so instead of sort of trying to figure out a way to sort of, you know, organize a sort of colorblind, class-based movement, which I think is what some of this sort of, you know, sort of descends into, it becomes about how do you build a multiracial, multinational, multi-gender coalition of people, because that's what, you know, movements are in general, right? Whether you're talking about the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the anti-war movement, and whether you're talking about the Russian Revolution, right? Like these are sort of, like these are movements across difference, you know, even if folks aren't necessarily framing them that way. You know, so that's sort of how I step into it, right? On the one hand, there's this thing called racial capitalism, right? But there's this thing called capitalism that intersects in terms of, you know, oppression across difference. But then there is a way to sort of organize this in a way that isn't necessarily dependent upon vanguardist politics, right? Which I do think can present its problems. So, I mean, that's sort of how I sort of approach that tension, I would call it. And then the last question in terms of, you know, how to sort of, you know, you're building something from the ground up. And I think, one, everyone has to be clear about the values that you're trying to organize around, right? And you have to be very clear about the values that you're trying to organize around. And if you're organizing, and if democracy is one point, right, you all have to figure, excuse me, you all have to figure out, right, how do we make this structure that we're building the most democratic in practice? And how do we practice this, right? I mean, because sometimes we put together some bylaws and we say, this is how we're going to do. And over time, right, you sort of drift away from that, whether, you know, whether you're shrinking or whether you are sort of expanding, right? I mean, and that's the thing is establishing principles, but then also being thoughtful about the ways in which, how will we continue to sort of implement and work and practice these principles as we grow, right? I mean, because growth, you know, is great, but it also presents its own sort of challenges that you want to have, you know, but I think sometimes when things grow, right, you lose sight of, you know, what you're trying, the principles you're trying to organize around, because the goals, you know, you might, there'll be some debates around the goals, but it's sort of, I would argue, a little easier to agree what you're trying to organize for than how you're going to sort of actually practice this politics as an organization.
Thank you very much for your talk, and I especially appreciate the way that you characterize representative democracy and economic democracy as distinct things.
Yeah.
But the question I have for you is sort of a practical, I'd love to get your perspective on, for one thing, fatigue within this work, and then also hesitancy from people who are maybe not feeling the solidarity that is so necessary to generate a movement like this. For one example, I've been a part of the Graduate Student Assembly for many years here at UNL, and one of the things I've heard when talking about unionization is, oh, well, I don't get my stipend from the university. I get my stipend from the USDA, so there's no reason for me to be a part of a union.
Yeah.
So that kind of position, I'm interested in your perspective on this.
Yeah, I mean, so, yeah, fatigue is real. That is, you know, there are things that can sort of shrink an organization, and, you know, some of the obvious ones, right, would be sort of personality conflicts and personal conflicts, especially when there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of activity. But fatigue is the other one, right, which also can sort of feed into this. And I think this is sort of where, you know, you think about establishing a, you know, as democratic of a structure as possible, that is sort of one spreading out the labor as equally as possible. You know, but then also, right, I mean, I think the fatigue question runs into the membership question, right, in terms of the more people you have to sort of, you know, share in the labor, the less tired and fatigued people are going to get. You know, so, you know, it's always that sort of trying to figure out how to get more people involved. But then I think there are like sort of practical matters when it comes to this too. So, you know, one of the sort of, you know, at least in Black history, right, one of the sort of greatest instances of solidarity was the Montgomery bus boycott. Imagine getting a whole Black population to not do one thing for 381 days. That is a long time. And people by and large, right, I mean, this is sort of, I mean, a boycott, you know, sort of economic strike, and there were some things that the Montgomery bus, like the folks who were organizing this, did. On the one hand, right, we had a lot of people who were sort of motivated, and then also you had a power structure that wasn't listening to folks, right? I mean, like they refused to negotiate, or they negotiated in bad faith, which just then sort of generated more opposition. But no, I do think the mass meetings mattered, right? Like, I mean, like when, you know, the organizers were getting the community together, and they basically, I mean, I'm not a churchgoer, but E.D. Nixon wasn't a churchgoer. He was at the mass meetings. And these mass meetings were a place for people to, one, obviously strategize, two, celebrate, three, sort of, you know, speak out. And it became a release for a lot of people, because obviously this moment was extremely intense, right? I mean, like they were under legal threat, and they were under the threat of violence, right? And obviously, right, this is going on for a whole year, right? Folks should be burned out rather quickly, you know, when sort of operating in those conditions. So it becomes, you know, what kind of activities, you know, what kind of events, you know, can we sort of organize that helps keep people involved, especially during a campaign, or these things can sort of help expand, because, yeah, like organizing organizing and protesting, you know, is a job in itself, but you also have to sort of find places and make spaces where you can actually be full human beings too. You know, so like, yeah, not every day, like, there might not be a meeting every week, right, or something of that nature, where you're sort of, you know, allowing folks to be burned out a little bit, but being able to sort of come back to the work, right? I mean, so, I know that's sort of very general, you know, because I think it's going to be particular to everyone, to the group itself and what you want to do. But no, you got to allow yourselves to be full human beings, but be full human beings together, right? It can't just be this sort of individualistic self-care stuff.
On that note, I think we should end, because it's 7 o'clock and we have the space until 7 o'clock. Strongly recommend when the book is out, and that will be a response to your question also, Julia, in terms of a reading list. Undoubtedly, there will be a fantastic reading list in your forthcoming book. Do you have a sense of like when the book might come out? Like,
it's going to be a few years.
A few years.
A few years. I can get the book list much quicker now.
No, like, you know, like, good books take time.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
In this spirit, thank you so much, Dr. McCoy. It was an excellent talk. If anyone has any questions, we can sort of like move sort of to the top, the Grand Hall, and if you're, you know, I'm sure you can have a little chat there.